Join me, Phil Stephanie, and Russell Gerber on an interactive show designed to give you more insight and context to all things African. On point today, big tuskers of Tembe. We've got some of the up-and-coming tuskers, a little bit of the history, and a fair amount of concept discussion between Russell and I, and hopefully all of you, with regards to conservation and going forward in the future. Just a quick reminder before we get cracking that if you would like to ask questions, which is definitely recommendable, we always love it to involve the conversation with all of you, but you will need to register in order to ask any questions and get involved. So if you're not registered, it's a pretty quick and free process to do so. It'd be great if you could. The more questions that are relevant to the show, that would be awesome. And also just a reminder that the On Point show is really to bring up topics and have discussions on things that we see on Africa and things to do with wildlife. So if you do have any questions, to keep them sort of on topic so we can all learn as we go along. So let's get into it. The big tuskers. Russell, it's always a big question. I guess the first question is, what makes a big tusker? What's the big deal? What are the criteria for a big tusker?
Thanks, Phil. Lovely to be with you all again. And thanks for joining us, for those of you who are out there. And yeah, it is a question we get pretty often on the show. On the live cameras, we often get these big tuskers coming down to the water holes, and people ask, what is a tusker and why is this area so special? So we've got this lovely picture up now of one of Tembe's most famous tuskers. And really the definition is quite vague. For the most part, people will generally say that an elephant that has both tusks of around 100 pounds or between 40 and 50 kilograms each will qualify as a tusker. Of course, that generally means that these are pretty older elephants, and generally male elephants who tend to produce bigger and thicker tusks than their female counterparts. Another way or trait that is often given to tuskers is, do the tusks actually touch the ground? Now, that's not necessarily a requirement for them to be dubbed a tusker, but of course any potential elephant that has tusks that size will definitely be considered a tusker if his tusks are scraping the ground as he walks. And as you can see here, Silo, one of our most famous elephants from Tembe, had tusks that pretty much almost did that as he walked along. So though that definition is quite vague, as I said, that tends to be the criteria, that 100-pound mark for each tusk and the length of them. And again, it's becoming more and more rare in many of our populations. And because of that, of course, Tembe is one of our favorite locations on the cameras and one of the most important tusker conservation areas on the planet. Which, of course, brings us to the next section. And one of those things is, of course, where else do we get tuskers? We have them here at Tembe, which, of course, we're focusing on. But where else do we see them? And one of the things that is interesting, of course, is that they spread out throughout Southern and East Africa. So
Classic, Russ. Thanks, man.
I'm going to pass it on to Phil, and he can give us some info on where we find these guys.
Before we go there, I just want to say hi to Suki. How are you doing? Thanks for joining us. Marcel, as I'm sure you remember, the safari guards always play games with us. Sure enough, on the live cameras, there is a nice big elephant bull. But we'll leave that for later. He might be around. And hopefully, when you go back into viewing the elephants later on the live cams, you'll have a different understanding of some of those big bulls. And I just want to carry on. This big bull in the waterhole in this photograph right here, this is the famous Silo, which means king in Zulu. And it's quite an interesting concept. 100 pounds. So a tusk has to be over 100 pounds. It's roughly 45 kgs. That's almost 2 human beings on your head. That's a fair amount of weight to carry around. So back on point, I've got some maps here just to give you a bit of scope and perspective on where one finds big tuskers. So Kenya is that green patch up there on the right-hand side, is probably some of the original big tuskers. Tsavo National Park, as well as Amboseli National Park. Then we've got South Africa in pink. Interesting color choice for a bush. Thought we'd mix it up a little. So northeastern side of South Africa, next to Mozambique. And those are the 3 countries at the moment that are well known or associated with the last remaining tuskers on this planet. So that's quite an interesting concept, that there's probably only about 30 tuskers left on the planet. And 11 of them at the moment are considered to be on Tembe, which is quite spectacular. We'll go through a little later on the show the concept of the next generation and the up-and-coming tuskers. But for the time being, we can see Tembe there. We're also going to come back to this slide towards the end of the show with regards to where we're going with conservation and trying to preserve this gene pool. But before we do that, I've got quite an interesting slide here, Russ. Maybe you want to go through what is a tusk?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. This little diagram brings me back to my university days. Reminds me of those scary questions you'd get in an exam where you'd have to identify each part of the physiology of an animal. So just with the little yellow lines and no names. So it does bring back some fear for exams, but this is actually a really helpful diagram for those of you out there who've never really seen the skull of an elephant or a pachyderm, and to actually see the tusks themselves underneath, of course, all that muscle and all of the tissue around the skull area. And you can see here that really the tusk itself is simply an adapted tooth, very similar to almost all mammalian teeth. This is an adapted incisor. In the case of elephants, you get different types of tusks in other animals, of course, like hippo, which is an adapted canine. But in the case of elephants and our tuskers, this is really where it all starts. So as you can see, you've got a fibrous joint right at the base of the tusk, the pulp cavity where things actually start to grow from, nerves then growing from there into the tooth itself, covered by dentin, cementum, and then enamel on the outside. And of course, those are the strongest parts of the tusk and that get worn down slowly as things go. You'll see in the bottom right-hand corner too, there is labeled there a single nerve that goes through the tusk. And it's a question we get asked by you folks also pretty often. Can they feel it when they break a tusk off? And they can absolutely feel it, yeah. It's not quite as sensitive as our teeth perhaps, but it's certainly something that they can feel, and they can feel through their tusks, even if they're just using them to rub on the side of trees or whatever they might be using them for in that particular instance. And of course, it can be painful if they break one off in a fight or in the general use of the tusks. So I don't know, Phil, did I miss anything there? I don't think so.
No, it's perfect. The one thing that I've often thought of or actually been a bit confused about, and it's quite nice to understand the concept that there is a root to the tooth, to the incisor, the tusk. So often people wonder, when they break their tusks off, do they grow back? And the concept is the same, is that if the tip of the tusk breaks off, either in a fight or if they've tried to pull out a bigger root than they thought, and the root is still intact, the tusk will keep growing from the root out. If that root gets damaged, that tusk will no longer grow back, which I thought was quite an interesting one. You often see elephants with broken tusks, or and one wonders that. So if the root is intact, it'll keep growing. And the other thing that's always good to bear in mind, that if you do see an elephant, if you're out there on foot, it's probably the best case scenario of this, and they do have a broken tusk, and because they've got those nerve endings quite deep into them, they can get a little grumpy. It doesn't surprise me. Yeah. So I think that that gives us a really good idea. And also just to confirm that actual ivory is only on the last third or so, maybe half of that tusk, which is quite an interesting concept in terms of the impact that ivory poaching has on elephants. And again, we'll touch on that a bit later. But for the time being, the next question, Russ, is what do they use them for?
Yeah, we started going into it a little, and as Phil said, using the tusks to dig up roots and things like that. In this instance, we've got a lovely video here of some of our younger Tembe Tuskers, where you can actually see, of course, they're being pretty gentle in this video. Well, there you see them getting a little more forceful, but of course they use them for fighting. Males will use them to exert dominance on each other and to establish hierarchy in their small bachelor groups when they're out there in the bush moving through the various territories. And that's one way that they will use them. That, of course, is establishing dominance, allowing the bigger, more powerful males to eventually mate with females and help those genes to keep going through various generations and the gene pool, and in this particular case here at Tembe. So that's certainly one way that they do it. I know we've got another one too, which is an interesting one. This is just to see them actually interacting with the environment here at Tembe and on the cameras. Of course, they use them for foraging. In this particular instance, this big male was simply playing around with this water pipe that goes down to the water hole that they use at Tembe. Phil, I think you saw this happen actually when you were on camera a few months ago.
Yeah, it is fairly recent. I'm sure some of you might remember this as well. It caused quite a mess.
So it's not uncommon to see that, that even though the trunk, as you can see, is such a useful appendage and they'll use it for almost everything throughout the day, it is quite handy to have a big, hard utensil or tool like a tusk to use for leverage in this instance, to try and pull that pipe out of the ground, or to use it to dig in the sand. And of course, in many instances, when things start to dry up and they can't get hold of fresh grass and food, they'll use those tusks to get to bark on the trees. So underneath the bark, get to the cambium layer where there is a little bit of nutrition left for them to get to. And I think we've got a nice clip of that next that we can show you guys.
Yeah, so this one, Russ, is actually just an illustration of the feeding, and we didn't really, I couldn't find a clip of where they were using their tusks as such to chisel away. But if you look at that tree, it's actually quite well worn and it's gnarled on either side. And that would have come from elephants chiseling away at the bark. Very important tool. And they love to feed on bark. And ideally that cambium layer, so they'll use that tusk to chisel in there, and then their trunk to pull it off. It's also when they get to chiseling away at the bark, or the other one, of course, is digging in the ground for roots. That's when those tusks get worn down. And I must say, these Tembe elephants, apart from having large tusks in general, they also really, a lot of them, perfectly in proportion. If you look at some of the elephants from Tao, Some of them have really worn their tusks down properly. And I'm sure a lot of you understand or have heard of the concept of elephants preferring one tusk over the next. So you'll find you have left tusked and right tusked elephants. I think that photograph of Asilo, his bigger tusk was the right-hand one, so he preferred to use the left-hand one. So yeah, feeding is a big deal, and their tusks are really important for that. Here's another clip. Again, it's not exactly of them digging as such.
But as you can see, having a good push and a little bit of dominance exertion, as we touched on a little earlier. But you'll see as we go a little further into this video that they do actually dig into the ground with the trunk, and you'll see them start to actually use those tusks for that digging purpose as well. So there are many, many different uses, and as Phil said, there are many instances where those tusks will actually get worn down or simply break off in some instances. And of course, in certain parts of the world, elephants have more fragile tusks than others. And as Phil said, here at Tembe, they tend to be very well proportioned and very often have both tusks intact, even though maybe one a little bit more worn down than the other from that lateral preference that you see in a lot of mammal species. So an interesting concept, and of course, something that elephants use on a daily basis. And it brings us to, a point that we also get asked quite often of what do elephants do if they don't have tusks, and how important are they for them? And we'll touch on that a little further on in future generations and how things will go for elephant conservation. But it's certainly something that is interesting when it comes to the preservation of tuskers throughout Africa as we go forward in conservation in Africa.
Yeah, so now we've got a good idea of what tusks are and what they're used for. So now we start getting into the juicy questions as far as my mind goes, and that is, what happened to all the big tuskers? Where are they? Why are there only 30 left? I think at the moment there's a fair amount of elephants in terms of general population. They are definitely an endangered species, or certainly right up there with big concerns. But essentially, the question is, what happened to them? And it's clear there's big issues with hunting. Look, that's a big can of worms, which maybe we'll be brave enough to tackle at some point. But there's no doubt that historically, the concept of trophy hunting would have essentially taken out the big tusking genes, those elephants that would have had the big tusks. And by the way, it's not just the males. There's some famous females, especially in Kenya, that have got huge tusks, not so heavy, but in length, they're really big. But there's no doubt that the genes of big tusks used to be prevalent. And they were essentially wiped out on a beginning front of trophy hunting. Elephants with small tusks would have not really been a big trophy. And it's actually quite interesting in terms of, again, another potential can of worms, but evolution. But essentially that
For the
gene...
purposes of the show, we will believe in evolution.
Yeah. But it is quite an interesting concept that it's pretty well understood that big tusk gene was taken out through taking out the biggest elephants with the biggest ivory. The next generation, of course, the younger bulls that were allowed to mate because the bigger bulls were no longer, they would have spread a weaker gene pool throughout time, of course. But in elephants' case, it's relatively quick. There was a very large increase in both hunting and poaching. In 1912, if I'm not mistaken, is when the big elephant rifles came in being, where the impact was just greater. And as we may or may not understand that humans have had relatively negative impact on wildlife, and it's really happened quite quickly. So somewhere like Tembe and Mozambique specifically, they would have originally used this as a corridor going from northern Mozambique through Mozambique into Tembe. But Tembe had a civil war starting in 1977. If I'm not mistaken, it finished it in 1992. And elephants actually ended up taking refuge in the South African side, which happened to be Tembe. And the king of the Tembe people, he decided with a wonderful mindset to protect the environment that these elephants are taking refuge in. And so from then, 98 is when Tembe was opened up as a reserve. And they landed up with the original 7 big tuskers that had the last remaining gene pool in northern, or what's called northern or southern Maputoland, going into Maputoland to Mozambique. So it is a wonderful concept of keeping those older generations alive and carrying on that growth of genetics into the new generations. Now, that's what happened with regards to why there's so many big tuskers and why Tembe is so well known from the beginning, early stages. And what's happening right now, it's quite interesting. It's been established that there's 11 new generation elephants coming up, like this bull in the middle here. A great little clip of a small family. He'll be a dominant bull, but he will bring forth the next generation for us. And so we're looking forward to some new growth, the future of Tembe and the future of the next generation of big tuskers. And let's hope one like this little fellow happens to be a newly born young male. He's hardly managing to get up.
Hardly even standing.
But so the next couple of slides are quite interesting to take a look at, because they're elephants that we see and we will be seeing for the next little while. There's another youngster. But let's see if we get some photographs here, Russ, and let's discuss the new up-and-coming tuskers.
Well, yeah, I think as we go into the new or into the dry season now on the live cams, we'll be seeing more and more of these interactions. We'll be seeing more of the elephants back down at the waterholes, seeing more of the youngsters and the next generation. And as we watch them, you can see this one on the right is collared to, they're closely followed by the reserve. They're always trying to keep an eye on where they are, what they're up to, what their sexual status is. Are they mating with the females? Obviously, it's very hard to track the parentage of each individual elephant, but the signs all show that there's a really good population and good genes coming through in the growth of tusks and the future generation of tuskers. And one of the things, of course, that conservation conglomerates and different reserves try and do is, of course, to spread those genes around. And we're seeing that happen with Tembe. We've actually seen elephants moved across to nearby reserves to help improve the gene pool in terms of those big tusk genes. And it's likely that we'll see more of that as we go into the future and growing different conservation areas around Southern Africa and East Africa.
Thanks, Russ. Yeah, there's lots of interesting stuff. Just want to answer a couple of questions here. Jean, you ask a question, are we able to guess the ages of the big tuskers? It's quite an interesting question, that. So if you look at the body of this particular elephant right here, his tusks are huge. They're really big, nice and thick. But his body is, relatively speaking, small and also in great condition. So what's interesting about these elephants is that they've actually still got a lot of growth to do. So my guess, an elephant like this is somewhere in his mid-30s. Elephants actually have a huge tusk growth spurt between 35 and 45, which is their prime. So what we're seeing right now are, generally speaking, early 30s, maybe going into mid 40s. But these elephants, like this fellow over here, has got beautiful, you look at the thickness of his tusks. But his body is in great condition. He looks to me like he's in his prime. So these pictures that we've gathered here are pictures of the next generation. And I think in the next 5 to 10 years, let's keep watching AfriCam, you're going to see some really big changes and maybe even get some ellies that their tusks start touching the ground. So here's another last couple. Before, I just want to touch on one more. Let's go back to that map after this. Is another beautiful bull of the next generation. I'd like to just discuss one last question. There are some directions here. There's, in terms of media and elephants and basically what's going on and where we're going forward. And if we take Tembe as an example, here's that one of the maps we had right in the beginning of the show. Russ, and what I find that one of the important things with elephants at the moment is things like surveillance. Obviously, we have our cameras out there, which, by the way, play a huge role in not just entertaining us, but monitoring all the elephants that come through. So monitoring, they're using camera traps. They've got people doing lots of research right on Tembe. But then there's also the concept of opening up space into these trans-frontier parks. That part up on the top right, that's Maputo. It's going as a Maputo reserve. And if they do that, they might open more area. They're almost doubling what Tembe is right now. It's 30,000 hectares.
Yeah, they're looking at 26,000 increase is the idea. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And what's really great about that is that they are designating space, because the biggest problem is animal-human conflict.
Yeah.
So having more space for animals to freely move through, humans to get involved in protecting rather than getting rid of, is quite an interesting thing going forward.
Yeah, I think, trans-frontier parks have been success stories across Southern Africa and East Africa. We've seen it work in many instances, and really to curb that major point that you brought up of the conflict between animals and people, and really just space in general. The current 30,000 hectares of Tembe and around 250 elephants on the reserve, it's starting to reach the point where they need more space. So it's exciting to see these things happen. Obviously, there's a lot of ins and outs and complications, especially if you're going between countries, between South Africa and Mozambique. But it looks like, as you can see, there are a lot of people working really hard to keep the genes of these amazing Tembe Tuskers, to keep them going in future generations that we've been touching on throughout the continent, and let's hope it continues.
Yeah, thanks, Russ. I do think for me it's looking up, and I'm really excited to keep watching and following the progress of these younger bulls. And not only in Tembe, hopefully one day we do have plans to put cameras as far and wide as possible, but wouldn't it be amazing to have a camera up in Tsavo or something like that and compare big Tuskers of the future?
Amboseli too. I love Amboseli, so maybe we could get something up there. We'll chat to the guys, see if we can make some plans and grow things, and keeping an eye on all these big Tuskers all across the continent. Awareness is always the biggest thing for conservation, so for you folks joining us. Spread the word. And, let the people out there, let them know about AfriCamp. The shows will be up on the website, and you guys can watch them again and share them with friends. But, looking at this lovely big future generation Tembe Tusker, I think the future looks good.
Excellent stuff, folks. I hope that's given you a bit of a different idea, at least, maybe some food for thought with regards to the big tuskers of Tembe and big tuskers in general, concept of ivory, trade, all sorts of cans of worms. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks, Max. Thanks, Russ.
Thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.